American University in Bulgaria.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Tonight we have a very special event, an event called a guest lecture series sponsored by the fund of Yvonne and Dimi Panitsa. As you know, this year we started with a series of lectures that are dedicated to communism and the legacy of communism. This way, actually, we experience the double legacy of Dimi Panitsa, both as a vision and as a very generous sponsor of our university. And we have selected only 4 people coming from Bulgaria and abroad for this special kind of series of lectures. Tonight, it's my pleasure, real pleasure, it's not a cliche, to present to you, to introduce to you Dr. Georgy Ganev from Sofia University. He's also program director of maybe the most influential, intellectually speaking, think tank in Sofia called Center for Liberal Strategies. Dr. Georgy Ganev has his PhD from Washington University of St. Louis in the United States. After he came back to Bulgaria, which is also quite an unusual thing, as you know well, he became part of the Center for Liberal Strategies and began teaching at Sofia University, Faculty for Economics and Business Administration. Plus, he's appearing quite often on prime time, most important news and political talk shows about present situation in Bulgaria. And he's also loved by his students at Sofia University. Today he actually agreed to create a special presentation for AUBG students and faculty and leadership. Bulgaria's post-communist economic transition, myths and reality, and also to fit my great students of myth-making in history class. So, Georgy Ganev, and let me also invite you for a short reception after the lecture, where you can talk more freely with Dr. Ganev. Welcome to AUBG.
Let me turn this on. Okay, thank you, Evelina, very much. It is really a pleasure for me and a very high honor to be here tonight. Not in the least because I knew Dimi Panitsa through the years, and Yvonne, of course. We've met many times discussing legislation in Parliament, but mostly along the School of Politics in Bulgaria, where he was one of its creators and its biggest inspiration. So really for me to talk in a lecture series named after him and in his memory is a big honor, and I really want to also extend my best regards to Yvonne and wish her all the best. And along the lines of the way Dimi was approaching life and the world, he always was asking questions. He never just let anything just drop and be accepted lightly. So my idea for this lecture was to do exactly that with some of the things that to me look like myths about the Bulgarian transition from a strictly macroeconomic point of view. And then we'll compare them with the actual data to see how much of the myth is reality. We all know that any successful myth needs to have some shade of truth in it, shade of actual events, and how much is just talk. So we'll start, as any macroeconomist, we have to cover 4 things: GDP, employment, inflation, and external sector. That basically covers it all from macroeconomic point of view. Everything else is micro. So, so we start with the growth. Basically, the first myth that I've always had a problem of fighting with is that Bulgaria, during transition after communism, which was obviously a success in terms of growth, the transition is a failure in terms of economic growth. This is the graph. Of course, the average, the general measure of economic activity is the gross domestic product. It's a synthetic indicator which basically tries to cover everything, almost everything in the economy, how much value is produced for a given period of time. So the blue line is the real GDP total for Bulgaria, and the red line is the real GDP per capita in constant 2005 Bulgarian levs. Constant meaning we've cleaned out the effects of prices, so this is basically measuring gadgets, real stuff that is produced. In my class in macroeconomics at Sofia University, we call them injikoplaktors. As you can see, the red line starts below and then finishes above the blue line, basically meaning that the number of capitals is decreasing in Bulgaria, decreased by about 2 million. From what you can tell in this graph, yes, initially transition. This is, by the way, the 80s, which is the last decade of the communist period in Bulgaria. And we can see growth there. Now, this is the National Statistical Institute data, which is the most optimistic about late communism. You can find data sets that look significantly differently from this one. Basically, the most common one data set would say that the peak was in 1984. Since then, it was downwards mostly, or flat. But this is the most optimistic about communism. Even if we take this one, where the highest year is 1988, by the way, it was not 89, you see that by now, even with the global crisis, Bulgaria is way ahead. Even with the 2 million people less, it's producing significantly more value per year than it used to be, even under the peak of communism. So obviously, there was a period of failure. There was a period of very negative growth. It was the first 8 years of transition when Bulgaria was obviously not doing things right. So the second myth is that it's related to the first one. Because it's a growth failure, it goes, Bulgaria obviously falls further and further behind everybody else in the world. Now, this is the graph. This is the data. Obviously, macroeconomic data, we can have all kinds of reservations, especially on this one where we have this purchasing power thing, which is the noisiest thing on earth. But anyway, you can see this is Bulgarian income per capita compared to the world's average income per capita, measured in purchasing power standards, namely how much you can actually buy gadgets or injikoplaktors with your income. And you can see that in 1988, the same legendary 1988, Bulgaria was almost 40% richer than the world on average. And I have severe doubts about this one, especially the nominal exchange rate versus the dollar is highly doubtful. But let's have it, even this way. Again, by now, it's almost back there. After having dropped significantly in the first 8 years of transition, including the year 1989, which was before any significant change started in the economy. So we've had a bad period, but then we've had a pretty decent one going back to the peak of socialist times, almost. Okay, the third myth is about the employment. It's in several parts. We'll see that, first of all, the Bulgarian economy fails to create jobs. Not only that, it loses jobs through time. That's basically the idea. More and more unemployment, less and less people working. That's the story. Now this one is probably the most beautiful graph of all, but that's for people narrowly interested in economic cycles, because you get an absolutely clear, nicely outlined cycle. We have this is late socialism, 1988. We have more than almost 4.5 million people employed. Obviously, we know very well from the history of communism that this is an artificial employment. This is not really existing value-creating jobs in the economy. This is just everybody has to be recorded as working. Otherwise, it's bad. Communism looks bad. Then you see the huge loss of employment in the first 2 years of economic adjustment after the breakdown of communism. Most of these lost jobs are jobs that service the Comecon market, the organization, the International Division of Labor under the Communist bloc, which fell apart in 1990. So basically all these jobs were lost, especially the Soviet Union. But then you see that there is a rebound. Then again, a crisis. This is a crisis related to the real, actual reforms in Bulgaria, when actual enterprises were closed down because they were not producing well. There was privatization, and the first thing that privatization does is get rid of all the unnecessary labor. Not the first, but the second thing, because the politicians basically forbade them to be the first thing. They thought it was going to be a bad idea. And then you have a very significant growth in the number of jobs in Bulgaria to 3,800,000 people. And then you have the global crisis, where Bulgaria is not doing well. Absolutely, certainly Bulgaria is not doing well. But we've had 2 periods of job creation during transition. It looks like a cycle. It doesn't look like a failure. And besides, let's not forget that between here and there are 2 million less Bulgarians. So the number of jobs given 9 million, and this is the number of jobs given 7 million. Probably even less, who knows. So this is the second part of this myth, is that the employed people were not productive, less and less productive. This is probably the most striking graph of all. This is productivity, real GDP per employed person in real 2005 leva. And you can see that after 1997, it is a really serious growth in productivity. Only the crisis year, when the whole world was in the ruts in 2009, we see a drop in productivity. And since then, sadly, it's due to companies shedding labor and keeping up production, even increasing it. I have friends that tell me, I couldn't believe this 5 years ago, but now I'm selling more with twice as few people as before working for me. They discovered it's possible. That's the good things about crisis. You become much, much more efficient. But this is the productivity line. And you can see it's not very far in the future that will be double since 1997. The Bulgarian labor will be twice as productive as then. Obviously, productivity is growing, and it is obviously a very strong trend. Only a major global crisis just made a hiccup in this line. So the third part of the employment is about unemployment. And you know the difference between employment and unemployment is that employment is a fact, unemployment is an opinion. Who is unemployed? Tell me who is looking. The definition of an unemployed person is totally subjective. Still, this is the unemployment rate in Bulgaria starting with 1989. Well, obviously, under communism, you don't have everybody works. We're all these productive, good people under communism. And all of a sudden, you have this explosion in unemployment. This is in percentage of the labor force. The labor force is another matter which is in the eyes of the beholder. So it's an imaginary number divided by an imaginary number. That's the unemployment rate. Never trust the unemployment rate, okay? Politicians should pay attention to unemployment rate. Economists shouldn't. You get this explosion in the unemployment rate related to the loss of jobs that you saw in the previous graph. Then you have the cycle again of creation. Then you have of job creation. Then you have against the rising unemployment rate related to the real structural reforms in transition in Bulgaria. And then you have this huge drop. I mean, huge. Bulgaria was under 6% unemployment under the ILO definition, the International Labor Organization, by the year before the crisis, which in Bulgaria was 2008. In 2008, the rest of the world was in crisis already, but Bulgaria was not yet. We heard about it in 2009, always a year late. So since then, unemployment is growing, and it's growing to about 12-13% under this, again, very imaginary thing. What is in the numerator, what is in the denominator, both are very dubious numbers. But still, you see that there have been periods of dropping unemployment rate down to very low levels. Then the myth number 4 is about inflation. This is the third big macroeconomic indicator or set of indicators. Bulgaria has a high inflation. That's the way the myth goes. You look at this, now please know that this is a logarithmic scale. So the same difference here is 10 times bigger than the same difference here. So this is the inflation rate, average annual consumer inflation in Bulgaria. And we can see a very serious shift from levels about 100% or even 1,000 to levels that are pretty much below 10% annually. Now this is a very big shift. So we've had high inflation, yes, in the same first, guess what, 8 years of transition where we had the dropping GDP, we had the dropping employment, and now we have a high inflation in the same first 8 years. But then the inflation is what in all the books would qualify as the low parts of the moderate inflation. It's not low inflation by any measure, but it's in the low parts of moderate inflation. To give you the contrast more clearly is the second graph, which is in levels, it's not in logarithmic terms now. This is the actual inflation rates from 0% down up to above 1,000%. And you can see the first period, and then you can see the second period. It's basically down there. You cannot notice anything. Now, these are two very different inflations. Obviously, Bulgaria has had a high inflation episode, but since then, Bulgaria is having a quite normal for a catching up country inflation. Now, my favorite part, we enter here the external sector. It has a lot of implications. It's an especially important thing for countries like Bulgaria because we are a small open economy. We basically depend on the rest of the world, namely the European Union. The only good metaphor that I can describe the Bulgarian economy is it's a fly connected to an elephant. Okay? So external indicators are extremely important. So this is the exchange rate. The myth goes you need a flexible currency to grow. And it begins with the 1980s. You should take these numbers with a grain of salt because these are communist reported false exchange rates. You can do a sort of, you can try to do a shadow market exchange rate in those times. For example, I remember the times when my brother and I were buying illegal music on the streets of Sofia. Basically the dollar exchange rate when the official one was 1.8 level per dollar, we were buying it at 8 level per dollar. So obviously the real exchange rate was somewhere in between, but definitely not only 2. Anyway, you can see that there was a period of very significant, again, this is in logarithm because otherwise you lose these first years. They just disappear at the bottom of the line. And this is in logarithm, so this is This is the 1.5 where we sit there. This is versus the dollar because it's interesting. I mean, the euro is non-existent in the first part of the graph and then it's flat in the second part of the graph. The dollar is more interesting. So you get a very quickly depreciating lev, and then you get a pretty darn stable lev. So you have these two periods. And now, if you recall the growth between here and here, it was negative, and then the growth between here and here, it was highly significantly positive, especially the productivity growth, which is long-term wise by far the most important thing for the welfare, the well-being, all the wealth of nations, as Adam Smith would put it, is the productivity, of course. Then the myth number 5, again, on the exchange rate, is that you need a depreciating currency to export more. Basically, the myth goes, your currency depreciates, and that makes you price competitive on the foreign market so you can sell more abroad. So this is the export of goods and services in percent of GDP since 1980. And you can see that there is a period at about 40% openness, well, it's not openness, it's just exports, but about 40% of GDP is being exported in goods and services. And then you get a shift after the beginning of transition, and basically, especially in the last years, the trend is upwards, up to about 55–60% exports of national income per year. So this is a significant increase in your export capacity, first, and second, this is during the period when you have the stable exchange rate. This is the period where you have the falling exchange rate. So the falling exchange rate did not bring higher exports in Bulgaria. For some reason, the higher exports came during the stable exchange rate regime. And this is another of my favorite graphs. You need a depreciating currency to export more. This is the same myth, but with a different graph. This is by far my favorite. This is the share of Bulgarian exports in world exports. This is the only serious measure of competitiveness. How much you export relative to everybody else. Competitiveness means you compete with others. What do you compete in? In exporting, selling your stuff in foreign markets. So this is the only measure of competitiveness. There is no other serious measure of competitiveness. All the rest is an indirect indicator of this. And this is your real effective exchange rate. Now, the data here is only since 1997, but the theory that I told you about, saying that the more expensive your currency, the less competitive you are outside, would say that the link should be like this. Low real exchange rate, high competitiveness, high share in world exports. High real exchange rate, low share in world exports. What you get is the exact orthogonal opposite. The more expensive your exchange rate in Bulgaria, in this period, maybe next year it will turn back towards where it should be. But for these 15 years, it's exactly the other way around. And a very close relationship. I mean, this is an extremely high R square. Okay, we go to the 6th myth. It's again continuing with the foreign sector. The external debt of Bulgaria is too high. Now this is talking about legacies of communism. This one here, this one is the legacy from communism. Bulgaria went from having almost no foreign debt in the early 80s for various reasons, basically to being bankrupt at above 100% of national income in foreign debt. All of this foreign debt was accumulated by the communist state, and the most important thing about it is that it was not used to create productive capacity. It was simply consumed. As I love saying, you flush and it's gone. You eat, you flush, and that's it. And you have the debt. You don't have anything to show for it. Now, then we had the problematic 8 years, first 8 years of transition, and then you have this remarkable episode of dropping foreign indebtedness, which then increased again. This is related to EU membership. All of a sudden, Bulgaria became a much better risk in the eyes of the international investors, so they decided to enter the country in big numbers, large numbers. When the crisis started, this has basically moderated back to below 100% of GDP. But then there is a very important nuance in the dynamic of the debt. Obviously, here, above 100% of that was a big problem, a huge problem. That was always in the news, whether we're going to pay the next service of the debt. Here, unless you're an economist, you wouldn't hear about a problem. It's the same size. It's a little bit above or a little bit below 100% of national income, but nobody is talking about it here. Nobody seems to be very worried except the European Commission. So there's a big difference in these two debts. And the big difference is, this one is clearly unsustainable. You cannot just borrow and eat. This one is mostly investment goods. Namely, you can trace almost one-to-one the increase in foreign indebtedness with the import of investment goods, which create productive capacity and help increase that productivity that you saw. So this is the second part of the sixth myth, is about the fact that it is important what is the structure of the foreign debt. And this is another very good graph that you see for the first time. You see this is built before, again, the data in this private public does not exist before 98, but before 98 the private part, which is the Bordeaux red sort of thing, is zero, basically. All the foreign debt is public. And then you see what happens. The public debt disappears, and this allows all the space for the private actors to get loans from abroad and do whatever they figure out with those loans. Or some foreigners coming in and making business. It's not only Bulgarian private business. So the structure of the debt has a very strong bearing on whether it's sustainable or not. Here, it's the state owes all the money. Again, more than 100% of GDP. The GDP then was less than $10 billion. Now it's more than 50. Of course, that helps, to carry more debt. But when the private sector owes all the money, it's an entirely different picture, especially given the fact that they've invested it in productive capacity. So the myth number 7 is related to foreign direct investment. And basically, this is a recent myth. It says, oh, foreign direct investment has stopped now. We're dead. No more foreign direct investment in Bulgaria. Guess what? Well, yeah, this thing with 2007 is not going to repeat itself ever. When I say to people that Bulgaria had a net capital inflow only on the FDI side, forget about bank and other channels, of 32% of GDP per year, all foreign macroeconomists tell me, check your data, it must be wrong. And I tell them, no, it is not wrong. This is the amount of capital that entered Bulgaria. This is the crazy stuff. It's never going to happen again. It drops down very quickly with the financial crisis, but then it stops at about 4% of GDP for the last 3 years. 4% of GDP might sound like little, but this is the sum total of every 90 plus 91 plus 92 plus 93 plus 94 plus 95 plus 96 is less than 4%. So every year in the last 3 years, Bulgaria has attracted more foreign direct investment than the sum total of the first 7 years of transition. Given the fact that it's a crisis, nobody is denying that. But it's obviously not nothing. Another joke is that half finance ministers on earth would cut their mother's hands if they can get 4% of GDP FDI inflow in this crisis. So it's not that bad. This year is a bit worse, by the way. But that's probably for other reasons. What might that be? Now, the last myth, which I'm going to discuss maybe, or I have another one, my favorite, the current account balance. It's unsustainable with the fixed left. Basically, the story goes, we have a fixed left, we have a higher inflation than our major market, which is Europe. That means that Bulgaria is losing competitiveness because its prices are rising faster than in our major market. That means Bulgaria has to borrow from abroad, which means current account deficit. The story was working beautifully until the crisis. Yes, Bulgaria's current account deficit was exploding like crazy. World records down there, 25% of GDP current account deficit. Everybody says, this is unsustainable. You're gonna crash. You're gonna have all kinds of, the Baltics, they have nothing. You guys, that was true. All the foreign observers, especially private banks who love floating exchange rates and wanted to advise Bulgaria to change its currency board, they basically said, this is an unsustainable current account deficit. You have to crash to get out of it. Well, the Bulgarian economy had a sort of a 5% recession, average European recession. Everybody in Europe had a 5% recession in 2009. And basically, the current account deficit disappeared within 2 years, absolutely unexpectedly to any of those observers. Because they forgot there was another story. And the other story was, well, maybe we're having this current account deficit because all this capital wants to enter the country. Nobody's forcing the capital into the country. The country is not asking to borrow money, and most of it is coming in the form of FDI anyway, which is not loans. It's ownership. And when they come in the country, obviously after that, several months later, you get all the investment goods coming in the country, which is trade deficit, which is a part of the current account deficit. So basically the other story says, this thing, the blue line, is leading the red line. So if for some reason the blue line disappears, the red line will disappear, go down to zero, up to zero in this case. Guess what? That's what happened. Talking about one theory making the wrong prediction and the other theory making the right prediction. Choose your theory. But basically, this is one of the myths that, oh, the pegged exchange rate is creating this uncompetitiveness and then you open up your current account deficit. The other story is, you're attracting money from abroad, and that by definition opens up your current account deficit. I mean, basically, any situation in which foreign saving wants to enter a country more than local saving wants to leave, you have a current account deficit. And the situation was drastic in Bulgaria, especially with EU membership, and before that with NATO membership. The risk profile of Bulgaria changed dramatically. So you have all this inflow of capital, and you have the current account deficit explode. And the moment the inflow of capital stopped, you might call it a sudden stop, under Guillermo Calvo, and the current account deficit disappeared. It's even entered into positive territory. It's still positive this year. So I'm going to sum up all the myths. The first one is, actually the Bulgarian economy has grown during transition. Probably would love to have twice as much, but it is positive. Bulgaria has not fallen behind. On the contrary, it has caught up to the place it had in the late communist period, if we believe the communist data. Employment is fluctuating around something that seems like a stable level of between 3.5 and 3.8 million people, jobs. There have been periods of very low unemployment. Again, below 6% for a country like Bulgaria seems like a lot. We have structurally large portions of the population which you shouldn't expect to be employed. Inflation has been moderate to low in the last 15 years. Yes, it was high before that. That's true. The fixed exchange rate has definitely not damaged competitiveness in Bulgaria. The external indebtedness can be high in two ways, unsustainable and sustainable. So it's not just the number that tells us the story. Even during the global crisis, the FDI is higher than the whole of the early 90s. And the current account deficit can be high in two ways, unsustainable and sustainable. Even extremely high in a sustainable manner. Namely, the economy automatically adjusts without any big problems to the change in capital inflows. So basically, this is the story Yes, this is the story that I wanted to tell you. Do we have time for the little show? Okay. Okay, this is the story in dynamics. Let's see if this one is. Yeah, let's try. Can you? Yeah. See, this is in 1990, 2000. This is well, I didn't change. This is foreign direct investment. This is deficit in the current account. Then press this one, please. This is the middle years, where all of a sudden foreign direct investment starts picking up. The question is, do you think which is following which? The blue is following the red, or the red is following the blue? Now play this one. This is the big one. And then press the last one. So, which is following which? That's the question. Okay, thank you.
The floor is yours now for questions.
I would like to ask you a question about famous plan that is demonized by a lot of people nowadays, the plan that is called refutes. There are many opinions that it is the reason for the bad situation in Bulgaria now, etc. But in fact, as far as I know, this plan actually hasn't been implemented. Do you think that if it has been, things would have been better now?
Okay, first part, you're absolutely correct. It was a plan that was never actually implemented. On the contrary, for 8 years, the same 8 years that we mentioned several times, Bulgaria was trying to not do the basics in that plan, to find the so-called third way of transition somewhere between communism and the market democracy with the private property and everything. And that's the thing that actually crashed in the mid-90s, that attempt to find a third way, which doesn't mean theoretically that the third way does not exist, but definitely means Bulgaria couldn't find it. On the second part of the question, and only after 1997, 98, major portions of what you would find in ran out, but it was by then conditionality by the IMF, the World Bank, and everybody else on earth. It was not ran out. It was basically privatization, sound money, sound fisc, sound budgets, and so on. And of course, structural reforms in particular sectors, competition, and the rest. Since then, Bulgaria has had pretty decent growth. Again, we might wish for more, but it's not really bad. On the question of what would have happened if the plan were implemented.
Can I just rephrase?
Yeah.
It has been implemented in the beginning of
Yeah, in the beginning. Most likely, the only thing we can draw analogy with, I mean, basically that's the way to go in this case. It's a purely hypothetical situation. The best place to take would be Poland, which basically very quickly, relatively very quickly implemented many things which were in that plan, like especially privatization, competition, and structural reforms. Less decidedly, they implemented sound monetary and fiscal policy. They have problems even. Well, they adopted inflation targeting later, but with the fiscal policy, they still have some problems. But the result was that by 1993, Poland was growing pretty quickly. So they had a transition recession, ended very quickly. But let's not forget that the 80s was a very depressed decade in Poland. So their starting base was very low, probably lower than Bulgaria's. So it would be a good analogy, but we cannot rely entirely on this analogy. It's very difficult to say what would have been, but most probably the economy would have dropped less because less links would have been lost, and probably more importantly, less anti-reform strategic elites would have entrenched themselves which they did in those 8 years, and we still have problem with them.
By the way, the plan is available in the library, so you can read it for yourself and make your own mind.
I hope also the library has the reports of Petr Mladenov in front of the plenum in December 1989. It's an excellent read. Everybody should read it.
Please refresh our memory for those.
Well, he basically says the dire situation in the last time I reread it was when Stanishev recently said that it was after the first student occupation that Bulgaria went to this dismal land reform and the agriculture went down. And I read Petr Mladenov, who says basically the agriculture is down. It's down the drain completely. You have to import all the food and all of this in December '89. Obviously, a student strike of 7 months later couldn't have caused that.
The Prof reported this in his book about myths of Bulgarian transition.
Yeah.
Yes, do you have other questions? Yes?
What are your predictions about the future of Bulgaria's economy?
Uh-oh, the crystal ball thing. Well, it's highly dependent on the Bulgarian politics. And I cannot predict that one. Actually, the fact that the Bulgarian economy is carrying itself pretty well under all this political uncertainty which we've had over the last, let's say, 10 months since February, basically means that the Bulgarian economy has become seriously resilient to political failure. Because what we have in Bulgaria is a political failure of the political system to govern the country. I mean, right now we have a territory which is not being governed. And the economy is still going. This is the first time this has happened in Bulgarian history. Usually, when the politics go down in Bulgaria, the economy follows immediately down the drain. I mean, it's highly dependent, always it has been. But now it shows a very serious resilience, and if the European economy picks up next year, this is the short-term forecast, then probably the news would be on average good, but definitely there would be a growth, but not as high as it could have been under a more stable anchoring expectations political system. Further down in the future, Bulgaria has two extremely serious problems. One is the demographic picture with the implied deficits and obligations of the public budget, and the second one is the human capital. Well, those of you who are in Bulgaria anyway. It is a very serious problem because there is a very big mismatch between skills and the requirements for a modern labor market. The labor market legislation, of course, is dated, but that everybody knows. So unless these two challenges are met, basically, gradually, Bulgaria will start probably losing competitiveness, regardless, due to structural reasons. But that's an if. I cannot predict, maybe they will be met.
Other questions? Yes.
I think people believe in myths. There's something about the myth that they prefer to the fact. It seems like all these myths that you run through about Bulgaria's economy are kind of depressing myths. What is it about? What's the explanation for the attraction of the myths as opposed to the facts?
This is a very tough one. I probably won't have a definite answer, but a lot of it is, you might call it perception. We've tried to ask that question. Why don't Bulgarians notice growth? And we tried to ask this question even in the early growth years, like 2003, 2004, before the big ones of 6, 7, and 8. We came up with a hypothesis, and I mean the Center for Liberal Strategies, we did this analysis on the pessimism of Bulgarian transition. And the one is that the growth which is happening for many people, of course, there are some actual losers from transition who are completely correct in saying things are worse for themselves. But there's a number of people who are actually living better, especially in material standards, but then they feel like unhappy, dissatisfied, and also they feel like the future holds bad news. And we found a theory. We have a theory, a hypothesis, nothing more. One possible explanation. And it is the fact that for them especially, they were socialized in late communism, which is an important factor. And basically they have stamped on their brains a certain model of development, which is the Marxist socialist model, where you build big industry and smokestacks and huge enterprises, and everything is big, and then you're doing well. And the growth that's happening is small, namely small enterprises, especially the services. Marx doesn't recognize services at all. Services are not included in the net material product under communism. They just count as nothing. And most of the growth comes in services, of the actual growth on the ground. So people who are stamped with this model are bound to first not notice the model. They say, I don't see new big plants being built. I don't, on the contrary, I see being closed. This cannot, even if somebody reports better years now, this cannot last. It will crumble at some point. They're absolutely certain about that. We asked them specifically, we had anthropologists actually going down on the terrain, asking people, that's what they got. This, yeah, it might be nice for a year or two, but then it's going to crumble. It cannot hold. It's unsustainable because it directly contradicts their own model of development. There is another explanation, which is increased inequality, which is obviously stressful for people, so they don't see things as good, even if their personal life is better. And there is a third one, which is comparison basis. Now, if you have an Opel and you compare with a Moskvich, that sounds nice. But if you compare with a Beamer, it's bad. And this has shifted. This can be shown that Bulgarian comparisons have shifted from the Soviet Union to Germany, basically. And that's the standard we're looking at. Well, we're not doing as well as Germany, most definitely. So in terms of this relative evaluation. And of course there is a fourth explanation possible. Did they become already four? Which is basically the explanation that other portions of Bulgaria's transition have failed, and people simply by association transfer this to the economy, like the justice system. Basically, there's rightfully not a feeling that Bulgaria is a just place to live, a just society, and people basically transfer this. And it's also insecurity in your property rights. I may have many things now, but they can take it in a day. So why should I feel happy about it? So basically, we have four ideas. Maybe all of them are true to some extent.
Yes. Okay. I hear you say, from a very actually optimistic point of view, that Bulgarian economy, when you put it in a historic context, starting with the transition and even before that, communist period, has come a long way. This is absolutely true, and I agree with it, and I'm sure that most others would do so as well. But if you take the pessimistic perspective and see the wrongs of Bulgarian transition over this period of time, especially since let's say 2000. First of all, we realize that despite the incredible success of the currency board and the fixed exchange rate regime, and I also believe that's the perfect regime for Bulgaria's small economy, yet the Bulgarian economy has been very much susceptible to external shocks, especially coming from the European Union, because de facto we have in this country a euro-based system. Because of the contraction in the European Union, we have seen a dramatic contraction also in exports and a dramatic contraction or stagnation in demand. So the Bulgarian economy has been one of the worst hit by the crisis in the European Union as well as the Greek crisis. There has been a sizable contraction in FDI and a sizable contraction in the private lending flows into the country. So when you look at the FDI, you see also in your graph that there has been a sharp contraction. But this has been, I think, partly the result of the corruption and the stagnation in the reform process. So there has been less emphasis on reform.
Yes, yes,
in the last
yes.
couple of years especially. So we can call it a reform fatigue or whatever the popular name for it is, but I think Bulgaria has this kind of problem in the last years or so. But for me, what is more important is the fact that despite all the good trends in terms of debt and so on, there has been this excessive, well, I call it sensitivity to external shocks in the system, part of the European Union, small open economy, it's natural. But Bulgaria has been really one of the worst hit in terms of growth. It's one of the most stagnant countries in terms of growth in European and Southeast Europe as well, and Central Eastern Europe. And I believe that partly this is the result of some of the political dynamics of the country, and sometimes corruption is considered as the major reason why FDI has fallen so sharply, even more than other countries in Bulgaria. And second, there's been a major reversal of funding flows out of the country because really the external lending stopped to Bulgaria through the banking system. So how do you place all these facts into the mix?
Okay. Yes, well, I'll have to a little bit disagree on some of the facts. I don't think the Bulgarian economy is extremely stagnant compared to, let's say, even if we take the peer group here in the Balkans, Slovenia, Greece, Cyprus, Romania, they're doing better, but marginally. It's within the, the measurement error better. It's in per capita terms, real GDP is above 2008 already, even if slightly. Everybody would love to grow like the Baltics, but they're still below their 2008 levels, 2007 actually. So whether this is a stagnation or not is an issue, but you're absolutely correct that Bulgaria has a serious structural problem, and this serious structural problem is the friendliness of the internal environment for doing business. The biggest problems of all being the fact that the Bulgarian economy is the internal level of rivalry in different market niches is very low. Basically, the structure of those strategically located elites that I mentioned already, which have come to be known under the term of oligarchs recently, their strategy is to separate a single niche, raise a hedge around it so that nobody can compete with them. And then they charge, of course, monopoly prices. They live very well, but obviously this suffocates the long-term growth perspectives. The best example of this I can give is the proposal for the Lavka. I don't know if you've heard about it. But basically, as a proposal, I'm the only one who can sell cigarettes and nobody else can sell cigarettes. Why? No answer. Well, that's it. I want to be the only one selling cigarettes. Well, of course, that's for smokers to care about. I don't care about it. I don't smoke. I don't have feelings about smokers anyway. They can do whatever they like. But that's the situation. I just want to grab the final client at the throat and suffocate them. This is the philosophy, and basically many of those people have managed to separate different niches, especially at the local level, because one of the weaknesses of Bulgarian competitiveness legislation, actually competition legislation, is that it treats monopoly at the national level but we have all these local monopolies that are actually doing all the damage. So people, from the perspective of the people, of the final client, they are under a monopoly at every margin. Even though nationally there are many producers, in your village it's only one supplier. So this is a big problem that has to be addressed. And of course, again, it has to be addressed through the political system, because the problem is more of a political than economic nature. It's the way society is structuring its relations. And this is the big problem. And again, we will go down to the justice system, which is supposed to enforce such things, which is another big problem. And these are the biggest longer-term threats to Bulgaria. So, of course, if property rights are not well protected, you wouldn't expect private capital flows into the country. On the contrary, you would expect them to go out, which would generate a very beautiful current account surplus, but other than that would be very detrimental. So if you take the pessimistic view, unless Bulgaria manages to fix its political system and judicial system, the news are not very good.
Yes. Yeah. Let me ask the question about myths and maybe also explore a possible channel with economics education in the 90s. You know, isn't it the case that people who were teaching formally political economy theory in the 90s, they suddenly became sworn Keynesians because they loved to have to pursue active fiscal policy and to distribute income and do active monetary policy, which is basically the departure from abolishing currency board and pursue active monetary policy and interfere in the economy. It has this nice flavor to their old views.
It's true. You can find the root of many of the very unfortunate macroeconomic decisions in the early 90s. You can trace them back to people who are in exactly that mode. They have been previous political economy Marxian types who have transferred into Keynesian, basically relying on the fact that you can fine-tune. If you know everything about the economy, you're a clever guy, you can fine-tune things. Now, that worked for Keynes. Keynes was a really clever guy. But then not everybody is as clever as he was. And they basically tend to screw up. It also, you can trace them to this day. I mean, you can see people like Rumen Getchev who continue on the same page to repeat the same Keynesian things like fixed exchange rate is bad. I mean, it's not the best thing on earth. Let's have it. A currency board is a pretty restrictive system. But I completely agree with Dar that this is probably the least bad thing a country like Bulgaria can have. And in terms of monetary regimes, basically that's what you hope for. Once you have a monopoly on monetary emission, the only thing you can hope for is the least bad. It's also, they had the wrong moment. In a sense, the Keynesians of the early 90s in Bulgaria were unfortunate because Keynesianism works very well if you take the general theory, which is a very cyclical. It's not a long-term growth thing. It's just what to do with the cycle. And basically, the Keynesian theory is anti-cyclical. You do the opposite of what the cycle tells you to do. When the cycle is bad, you pump up into the economy, you draw the deficits, you increase the debt, and you oppose, the downward cycle. But the most important thing about Keynes, who never forgot about it, was when you're up, then you cool down the economy, you run fiscal surpluses, you pile up reserves, you pay off your debt, which is, by the way, what Bulgaria did in the 2000s. It behaved exactly as Keynesians should. Well, Keynesians I don't know about, but Keynes most definitely would approve. The problem is that the early 90s was a bad period. And once you're up to here with debt, it's very difficult to do the Keynesian thing, which is something which Western Europe also discovered this crisis. When you have not done your your building of reserves and fiscal surpluses in the good times, there is nothing you can do Keynesian in the bad times. At least Keynesian injections by far don't have enough to save you from the recession. The way to be Keynesian, in terms of the cycle, it's an entirely different thing what you're going to do for the longer term growth capacity. Keynes does not have anything to say about this, and he's very honest about it. But if you want to oppose the cycle, let's say to decrease at least the fluctuations, what you have to start in the good times, and you have to start by piling up reserves and running fiscal surpluses and cooling down the economy. And when the bad times come, you have reserves which you can spend, and then the multiplier will be probably significantly bigger than if you're piled up to here with debt. And the unfortunate moment for these people was that Bulgaria was exactly in the situation in the early 90s in which Western Europe was in 2008. They had too high debt, very high debt, and on top of it, it's very difficult to have a Keynesian injection. And it basically proves not very practical. Other than that, probably if you really follow the Keynesian recipe, you might smooth the cycle. It's not, nobody's denying that. But of course, you have to pick up the moments when you turn your policy, the turning points, which are crucially important. Basically, you know this dilemma between austerity and growth now, basically. The Keynesian says it's either austerity or growth. And the anti-Keynesians basically say, well, once you've allowed yourself in the good times to have 100% of GDP debt public, the question is either austerity or stupidity. So that's the choice, you know, if you've not done the Keynesian thing in the good times.
I think one more, yes.
If you were an omniscient social planner, where would you focus attention in the Bulgarian economy for the future? What would be your focus of development?
I will dramatically hide behind Hayek and Mises here and say I'm not an omniscient planner. I know that I know next to nothing about the deep underlying structure of the Bulgarian economy, especially people's preferences and firms' technologies. So my recipe would be let them discover, create the best conditions for them to discover which is the best thing to do.
And where would that be?
By allowing competition and protecting property rights. They would tell me, I don't know. I've tried that, failed miserably, never do it again. I don't know. Whatever I tell you will be wrong.
May I profit from my position here to ask the last question? Do you think that we have this, on the pessimistic side, some danger coming from the present political situation, that the leadership of the country is going to push us back to some of the previous times?
Sadly, it seems like at least portions of this ruling ethno-Nazi socialist coalition right now wouldn't be far away from the idea that actually their plan would work out better if Bulgaria were not in the European Union.
Yes.
I firmly believe some of them would say that, but others cannot afford. I think the Socialist Party cannot afford even to think something like that. The Socialist Party, its leader maybe yes, but the Socialist Party, which is a real party, no.
Let's see what the students are going to create as a... no, we have the opportunity to ask...
You can have me now again, still.
During the section in more informal way. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by AUBGTalks. For more, please visit us at aubg.edu/talks.